What's up guys, it's GM Max here, and in this video I'm going to show you how players like Vladimir Kramnik, the past world champion, actually were often playing the move 1d4, but not playing move d4 directly, but playing d4 openings via one knight f3 move order. And the purpose of this video is basically to show why I think are the lines which give white the best chance for an advantage within one knight f3. There's a potential foundation for a repertoire that you might decide to expand more deeply in your own time, or perhaps I will even do so at some stage. But for now, it's just to give you the overview of how I would construct my repertoire if I was wanting to play one d3 as a way of avoiding certain d4 systems that black can play. So after knight f3, I've made my main line the move d5, and the reason is I think that after d5, if white does want to fight for an objective advantage, he really needs to play the move of 2d4, while other moves do admittedly give black more chance of equalizing, as you would kind of expect. So after d4, knight f6, and c4, this is kind of where we have the main crossroads, where basically by playing one knight f3, it's saying that white is very happy to play d4 when black's committed to d5, but he may decide to play a little bit differently and try to get some value of the move order if black does choose to play some Indian defense with one knight f6. Okay, so position after e6 and knight c3 is one that can arise from quite a lot of different move orders, and of course is an absolute main line of normal chess in terms of the lines with one d4, where black has a very wide choice of options here. So let's have a quick look at them just so I can share what I would recommend against each one of them. We'll start with the semi-Slav, because the semi-Slav is the most common defense to 1d4 if we include all the transpositions, keeping in mind that this position could of course also arise from a Slav defense move order. And in this case, my suggestion would be to play the move e3. I mean, the move bishop g5 is sort of considered like an absolute main line, historically speaking, but I find these lines of more has been worked out to a draw in correspondence, whereas in the lines where e3 there's still some more room to kind of get a fighting position if your opponent's not just memorized theory. This can still choose a different type of position that you want. After queen c2 and bishop to d6. And I ultimately think that the move here that's probably the most promising is just to play bishop d3 and to enter these Maran lines where, you know, they can go dc4, b5. But where the inclusion of queen c2 and bishop d6 does add a whole host of other subtleties to the position, but of course this is not the place to go deeper into it, but I do think we can say white has the better side of equality. At least black has to find a lot of precise moves here to maintain the balance. So what about the alternatives? Well, if they played the classical lines with bishop to e7, this is of course something that's been played by a lot of good players. But again, after bishop f4, I think that the blackburn is the most promising, and that we give the bishop a very nice open diagonal that proves quite useful whether black goes e5, c5, or whether we go knight bd7, c5 ourselves. So again, it's a position where white can claim a very small pull. Of course, it's true, it is a very good line for black, and with correct play, it can gradually equalize. But still, with the extra space, white can definitely try to make something of this position, which is why you see this line quite a lot at a very high level. Now, after bishop b4, this was kind of an interesting one, actually, because this is a line that I actually recommend for black in the club play to expert repertoire. And the reason I recommend it is because I just couldn't find anything I really would be completely happy with as white in terms of something that would prove an advantage. So I think this is a line where actually gets justified to not necessarily go into lines like bishop g5, dc4, because I feel like those Vienna lines have more or less been worked out to a draw at a very high sort of level. Like, it's very forcing, and there are not a lot of particularly profound deviations along the way for white. And also cd5 kind of allows black to get in the bishop f5 lines, like I showed in the club play to expert repertoire. So my suggestion here would actually be to play a little bit of a shortcut with queen a4, where even though this is not the most common move, I think that stopping c5 in this way is quite logical. And I do believe that after castle queen c2 that white can claim again the better side of equality, based on the fact that without the c5 break, and with black struggling a little bit to get in the e5 push, the white can claim a very small pull, and definitely the position is easier to play for white, because at least it's not like a normal Rogozin where black gets in c5 or gets his bishop to f5 and gets very active piece play. So that's all my shortcut recommendation. Yeah, the move knight bd7 was a little bit of a tricky one for the repertoire, because I think that the best line for white is probably to go cd5 and to play bishop to g5 and transpose back into an exchange QGD. At the same time, if you want to play exchange QGD, it makes a lot more sense, I think, to play it via 1d4, 2c4, knight c3 move order. So I think it's not really worth playing a whole new opening, I think, just to basically, well, just to deal with knight bd7, which is not all that common a move. Which is why I would suggest the move e3, which it's true, objectively speaking, it's not probably giving as much of an edge as cd5, bishop g5, but in a lot of cases it can transpose other openings like after c6 or this sort of thing. which would transfer back to our semi-Slav lines. And it's actually quite a common move in practice. So anyway, that's all my suggested shortcut as a way to kind of keep consistent with our repertoire without skimping too much on quality. As for the move c5, well, the semi-Tarash is actually a very solid line for black nowadays. And, well, after cd5, this line of cd4 has more or less been worked out that black can sort of play kind of like a Berlin and just hold a very solid draw if he knows what he's doing. So this is a line that has become quite popular. But the thing is, you're only really playing for a draw as black. You don't have any real winning chances. And if black does play knight d5, which is more common, then after e4, I think that the extra space does give white a very small pull. Black's, of course, very solid, but white, has the center and a bit more active position, whereas black is playing mainly for equality. We have no real guarantee that he will achieve it. And finally, if black does play the dc4 move, going for a pure Vienna, well, I find that the Vienna gambit with e4, bishop b4, and bishop c4, it's still quite a promising line. I mean, I have to admit that with best play, black probably is quite close to equality, but still white gets a bit of an initiative and can get some slight pressure, where black at least has to find a lot of good moves to hold, as it were. So, with that being said, that kind of explains, well, the main move of knight c3, and of course, true, one thing you will notice with knight c3 is that even though it's the most common move, there are still ways for black to be able to equalize, because, well, that's the way chess is, that, black can neutralize white's first move advantage with correct play. Of course, there are other options like g3, but because I already covered this in my Club Play and Expert Repertoire course as the alternative repertoire for white, it's sort of why I'm not going to go deeper into it here, except to mention, of course, this is the main alternative for white in this position. Now, as for the Slav defense, I do think that playing the move knight c3 is kind of the most consistent, considering that we're happy to transpose back into the semi-Slav. I mean, the reason that the move e3 is sometimes considered at least marginally more precise, or at least sort of integrated play, is that it gives you extra options if black goes e6, but also gives options like bishop f5 or bishop g4, which why I'd recommend the main line, because I think that white does just get a small edge fairly comfortably if black doesn't transpose to semi-Slav with e6, which I think is just the best move here. If you play dc4, I find a4 to be quite a good move, and after bishop f5, knight e5, this alley variation of going f3 and e4, and main lines just seems to give white a nice spatial advantage, where black doesn't really manage to equalize. And okay, maybe the move e6 is a little bit better, but then after e3 and takes, you're going to kind of get an improved queen's gambit accepted, where black didn't get in the move a6. And while black's still, of course, very solid there, I still think white's just a tiny bit better in those positions. Speaking of the queen's gambit accepted, of course, it's possible to do it in this version. But again, we can go e6 free, and after e6, of course, some of you will recognize that this is what I actually recommended in the chess improvement repertoire for black as a very solid way to basically kind of ensure a draw. It's black if you play solidly and have some chance of play for a win if white overpresses or just doesn't really understand the position all that well. And since I already recommend the move d takes c5 in my play d4 course, okay, it's true, this is probably objectively the most critical line nowadays, which is why I recommend it in that course. But if I had to give a second variation, I'd probably say the move b3 is sort of the second best attempt, where white's going to play very solidly, where the bishop is quite active. And while black can sort of gradually equalize with correct play, white does have this slight, quite stable positional pressure, and white does tend to score quite well in practice, so I think it makes a very good practical choice, fitting with the spirit of playing one knight f3, as it were. So that covers the lines with the queen's gambit transposition with c4. Well, okay, we are committed to knight f3, so we lost a few options compared to play d4, d5, c4, but I think that's quite a small price to pay in return for getting some extra options against some of the other options where black doesn't play one d5 in the knight f3 move order. Now, there are other moves that black can try here, but most of them are just going to transpose after c4 anyway. One exception is the move e6, and black can try to play this in some sort of special way, such as the triangle system with c6. And in this one case, I think it does actually make sense to not play knight c3 and allow the note boom, but instead to go just e3, because knight f6, knight c3 is going to transpose back into our normal semi-Slav repertoire in the worst case anyway. Of course, after knight f3, e6, objectively you can probably improve on knight c3 and put the knight on d2 in certain positions, but it's from our repertoire perspective, this kind of is the least workload for us to just transpose. And if they play f5, I find that bishop d3 and just going for the thematic exchange of black's good bishop does tend to give white a small pull here. So the Stonewall is not really a best version for black. Well, it's hard to think of what is a best version of the Stonewall, but this is probably not it. And if black goes c5, plays a Tarash, I find that takes, and g3 to kind of get some value out of the move order, where by delaying knight c3, you avoid some options such as Dubov's CD4 line, and I think that white does get a small advantage and can indeed benefit from delayed knight c3. I do think he gets a slightly bigger advantage than he would in the lines with knight c3 and g3 included, as it were. In any case, that covers the d5 lines, and now we can sort of see the more, let's say, unique elements of the one knight f3 move order. Because, I mean, after d5, of course, it's true that those who have the playing the tricky one knight f3 repertoire, which might actually be where you're watching this right now. Well, of course, you'll note I recommend the move to e3 in that case, and of course, that's a whole different story. It's already been covered very well by me. So let's go into the move knight f6, which is the main alternative for black. So now I recommend playing the move c4, where we can get quite a lot of value, I think, out of not playing the move d4 too soon. For example, basically, one thing I've noticed is a lot of players both over the board and also in correspondence, if they know the opponent's going to play the Grunfeld or the Nimso, they're very often going to use this move order, meaning g6, with the move knight c3. And the point of this move order is that if black does play bishop g7, well, we go e4 and they didn't manage to get in their Grunfeld. Instead, we get a King's Indian, where I've actually recommended the move bishop e2 and castles in like a different place. I think I covered in a video in the chess improvement system. So that's why in this video, I've decided I would recommend a slightly different approach, where I think that the move h3 is probably objectively not inferior to the move bishop e2, to be honest. And after e5, d5, I mean, white's plan of going like bishop e3, knight d2, g4 in some order, and just playing to neutralize the f5 break and sort of neutralize c6 queenside play. My conclusion is I think white is a little bit better. Granted, if black plays accurately, I think he can neutralize this and gradually equalize, but it is true that, I think that white's plan is quite straightforward, and black will have to be very precise in order to neutralize the white initiative that comes up with this g4 in various lines. Anyway, I could say more about this, but okay, this is more to show what my basic recommendations are rather than necessarily to teach you how to play them, as it were. And sort of the skeleton, if you like. So, if black does try to play the Grunfeld with d5, well, after takes, you get quite a few extra options in this version that white can go for, as in you're not forced to put the pawn on d4. The modern trend these days is to play the move h4 and, well, kind of just sort of play h5 and try to create some weaknesses in the black structure. And there are some cases where if black is not careful, you can even just play e4, d4 later and transpose into an improved version of a normal Grunfeld, depending on how they deal with this h5 idea. So in general, we can say that white's pretty comfortable in these positions, and, well, I think that this line is at least better for white probably than the normal Grunfeld lines in terms of fighting for an advantage. Or at the very least, it's sort of practically more difficult for black. So also if they play the move e6, I mean, those who like the club player expert repertoire and really like my Catalan recommendation, well, in these cases, going for like the g3, bishop, g2, castles move order would probably be a better fit for you in these different systems, but because I'm focused on lines I do think give the maximum chance for an advantage, I'm recommending the move knight to c3, which is the logical fit for our repertoire, where in this way we're avoiding the Queen's Indian with b6, e4. Obviously, d5, d4 just transpose back into the 1, d5, 2, d4 lines that we already looked at. And if they do try to play Nimso with bishop b4, it's a much, well, not much worse, but it's definitely a worse version of the Nimso when you don't have the absolute pin on the knight. Where with the pawn d2, we can go queen to c2, get the bishop pair, and then basically having this open diagonal for the queen bishop is what basically gives white a small pull in all of the variations here. And finally, if black does play b6 and insists on the Queen's Indian approach, well, I find that g3 is a pretty good move, and, well, at some point, black's usually going to play c5 and transpose some hedgehog or double fianchetto, but admittedly, it's true that this time it will cover via 1 c5, because it sort of fits better for that. So after e6, they do insist on a Queen's Indian. Well, I mean, after bishop e7, we could even consider a move like d4 if we wanted, because we avoided all these shortcuts like bishop b4 and, c5 and this kind of thing. But I suggest that the way to get the maximum value out of move order is to go knight c3 castles, and then to play the move rook e1. It's quite a tricky move order where we kind of prepare to go e4 and potentially head towards a good sort of hedgehog for white. Or if they play d5, we kind of take and play d4 and get quite a nice sort of position in the center. Kind of like Catalan where the bishop on b7 is not really ideal, blocked by the pawn on d5 as it were. Of course, rook e1 is also not ideal for white, but still these positions I think are just very slightly in white's favour in these sort of Catalan type positions. So that basically leaves as our main branch then the move of c5. That is sort of the third main continuation, and of course it's possible after c4 and knight f6 that you could have seen black play knight f6 and then play c5. For example, you want to avoid something like a transposition to the Sicilian defense, for example. So after c4, knight f6, well, I recommend knight c3, as being the most flexible move in this position. And, well, I have the move knight c6 as the main line, and of course the move e3 and d4. That's the approach that I sort of recommended in the tricky 1 knight f3 repertoire. But I think that if white wants to get the maximum possible advantage, then probably g3 is going to give you the best chances, at least if black is not well prepared. Because d5 can be met with d4, and, well, these sort of positions are very likely to end up coming in some sort of semi-terrace sort of territory with c5, knight d5. White is committed to g3, and, well, it's a position where initially the engine will give white a very tiny pull. But I have to be honest and say that objectively black does have a few ways to equalize. So, of course, it's not a miracle weapon, but it's something that's very safe where white can sort of play for a win, knowing he's taking virtually no risk in doing so. And, of course, you might know a similarity between these positions and the Catalan. In any case, if they play g6 instead, well, I find that these lines are generally a little bit better for white, where you can meet d6 with d4 and just get that extra space in the center. Of course, if black would have castle, it would transpose back into the Fianchetto King's Indian, which this actually might be one of the better tries for black potentially. But if you were to play castles instead in d4, then again, probably d6 and transition posing a Fianchetto King's Indian might be the best try to equalize. Of course, it's something I have covered in some of my other courses in the past, like I think in the Club Play Expert Repertoire, and I think I also might have touched on it in the Grandmaster Secrets King's Indian course for black as well. But more often black plays a move cd4, and I think that these positions are just slightly better for white. There are a lot of moves that black has tried, like the recent trend is to go queen a5. But in general, white just keeps a very nice pressure down the long diagonal. That makes it kind of hard for black to develop its queen side, and along with the extra space that does give white a small and I think quite stable pull here. So going back some moves, I think then this position to move e6 is really the other major alternative, with the idea after g3 to go b6 and to transpose back into the hedgehog. But I find that these positions are ones where, again, white's position is a little more pleasant. After castle bishop e7, I think that probably d4 is a move that maybe gives white the best chance of an advantage. I do think that white is a little bit better in those lines. But there's also a move of rook e1 that also is, I think, quite ambitious. And if your opponent is not willing to enter the positions with d5, where black is more or less just playing for equality, but I do think that once again, e4 and d4, you get a much improved hedgehog if you're able to keep these bishops on the board and still take back with a knight on d4. So that would be my suggestion for this repertoire, because also it kind of fits well with our Queen's Indian recommendation as well, because in the Queen's Indian, if they play like c5, it would transpose back into this line. So that's why it's kind of a good fit in terms of getting the maximum value out of the move order and not kind of getting move ordered ourselves into some line sort of very different to what we would have otherwise played. And if they do play a move like knight to c6, well, I find after knight to c3, they don't really have a better move than knight f6 anyway, in my opinion. Because if they play a move like e5 or a move like g6, well, we just go e3 and just hit the center. And I find this e3 plan tends to be more effective when they're committed to knight c6, because you're often going to have d5 to hit their knight, and that will give you quite a nice central control and initiative. And finally, if someone does try to play d5, it's a move that you'll often see Grunfeld players play, where maybe they're not satisfied with the version with g6. So they try to sort of change the move on, go c5 and delay g6. But I find after takes, the move e3, which again is actually kind of quite a lot in spirit with the tricky knight f3 repertoire, well, it means it allows you to kind of go for either a move like d4, heading towards more semi-terrace territory, and also you can try to benefit from the move order by delaying d4, and kind of reducing some of black's options in that way. So it's a line where I think that it probably objectively is equal, but I do think that white gets to kind of choose the type of position that he wants here. I do think that practically white can be quite confident about the future. Also, lines like knight c3, d3 have also been shown to be quite safe for white if black does try to play it purely like a Grunfeld, because e6 is not exactly a Grunfeld kind of move in that sense, even though I think it is the best one for black. So that comes to move c5, and I just now want to quickly touch on a few sort of sidelines as well that black can play. So if they play g6, I think that the way to punish this move order is to go e4. And I find that a 1 knight free move order does tend to work best when you are willing to play e2, e4 in certain cases if they don't sort of play a move to control the center. And after d6, of course, I recommend a lot of different moves, like I recommend bishop c4 in the play 1 d4 repertoire. I recommend bishop d3 in the chess improvement repertoire. Another third line I also think is very good for white is to play knight c3. And after knight 6, I really like this shortcut with bishop to e3. I remember when I was covering the periods in modern in different courses, I always found this line very, very difficult to find someone I was happy with as black. Because white's playing a queen d2, bishop h6, and castles long. It's just so straightforward, and the fact that white also has the option to go h3 in certain positions and just play it more positionally, I think that black doesn't really manage to equalize in these lines, and it's definitely quite unpleasant from black's perspective. to, to just get some counterplay here. Now, black can also try to Dutch with f5, and okay, sure, I recommend the approach with d3 and e4 and the tricky knight f3 repertoire. But I think that the move g3 is very good if you're happy to transpose back into d4 territory after knight f6, bishop g2. Well, they played g6. I mean, of course, the move castles d4 and c4 is transposed to the main line and is somewhat better for white. But I actually think that with this exact move order, that the move b4 is actually not necessarily an inferior move to going for d4. I mean, it's not that we're doing without d4 altogether. We are still going to play it anyway to stop d6 and e5. But yeah, with this plan of just putting the pawns on d4 and c4, I know a lot of strong players have played this system with white, and it just seems very hard for black to get his usual counterplay with e5 when we are covering this this d4 square with the bishop and also grabbing a lot of space. So it's kind of like an improved version of some of the b3 double fianchetto systems that you might have seen in some other resources. And if they play e6 instead, then, well, for those who have the tricky 1 knight free repertoire, this is not exactly going to be new knowledge, but as a sort of revision, well, bishop e7, c4 and d4 are just kind of much better for white, where black doesn't really manage to get any real counterplay in his Ilyin-Chernevsky lines. I mean, the computer recommends d5, but then it's just a worse version of a stonewall with the bishop on e7 instead of the more active d6 square, and you're putting the bishop on f4 would be one way to exploit that. And if they play d5, then yeah, c4 and, you know, just playing like the d3, cd5, knight c3 in this sort of position. Black just doesn't really manage to find a good plan in the structure, whereas white seems to have just this much improved, well, sort of, it's hard to say what structure to compare it to, but it's just like much better for white according to the engine. So we can sort of take its word for it. Now, as for the other options, I do think that after d6, that we should play d4 and avoid the move e5. And okay, so there's a little bit of work in learning how to play 1 d4. But okay, it's true that we also learned this like with knight f3 d5 and 2 d4. So we're not really at all afraid of transposing back into d4 positions with this repertoire, of course. But we're basically doing it in a way where we avoid the Nimzo Indian and we avoid the Grunfeld. And okay, I guess you could say we avoid the Queen's Indian as well with this move order. So we kind of avoid quite a lot of systems basically. And still can sort of play our like d4 lines. Because obviously with black committed to d6, he's not intending to play a Grunfeld anymore. He's more committed to a King's Indian if he doesn't want to be considerably worse. Now, after knight c3, knight c6, well, we can just go d4 and just transpose back in the trigger, and which is well known to be quite significantly better for white if black plays a move bishop g4, but if he doesn't, then knight c6 just looks like a really misplaced piece, so it's not really a good line for black. And finally, if they do play a move like b6 or b5, then yeah, I recommend playing e4, and, well, initially it stopped here, but I guess I may as well point out that the reason this line is considered a lot better for white is that after e6, d4, knight f6, well, the move bishop to... Actually, probably move bishop b4 is a more precise move order, because otherwise knight f6, e5 could be annoying. But in this case, there's a very nice move for white here, where the most common move is queen e2, but it's actually a lot better to play knight to d2, just kind of breaking the pin on the bishop and being able to meet d5 with e5. And I find that these lines are just significantly better for white, which is kind of the reason why you don't really see the Owens defense with b6 at a higher level much, unless someone is sort of playing it like to muck around or as some sort of shock weapon, or let's say. So that's basically my knight f3 skeleton, where if I was designing a knight f3 repertoire with the intent of transposing back into d4 systems, I like old Kramnik, but also avoiding other ones like the Nimzo or the Grunfeld or Queen's Indian. Well, this is how I would personally go about it, in a way that doesn't, let's say, transpose to lines I already covered in my in some of my other courses. I mean, obviously we're playing the Club Play Expert repertoire, and you were playing the alternative recommendation of the Catalan there. Then yeah, obviously like a knight f3, g3 sort of move order, you know, with or without c4 first. Well, that would obviously be an extra option you would get, but that's why I think it's better saved for, well, for a different video, as it were. Anyway, well, now you know how to play knight f3 in terms of getting a maximum advantage, and the final thing I will add is I actually noticed in correspondence chess the move knight f3 is almost the main line actually in correspondence, and the reason is that in correspondence thought that the Berlin and Petrov are just virtually impregnable systems where it's very hard to even get a game. And whereas if you play d4, then lines like the Queen's Gambit accepted, and even stuff like the Grunfeld and King's Indian is just very, very hard for white to prove any sort of objective advantage, especially in the case like the Grunfeld and Queen's Gambit accepted, and even stuff like semi-Slav as well is very, very hard for white to really get a game in these lines at top-level correspondence. I mean, okay, it's true that correspondence chess probably very soon is going to be just completely solved and won't really be a playable game anymore, because people just turn on the engine and there'll be no way to win. Okay, I don't think we're at that stage yet, but I do think that is something that is going to come up in the future, where the engines will just be so strong that even a player playing to exploit the weakness of the engine still won't have enough of an advantage to actually win the game with white, or especially with black, of course, but even with white. So anyway, that's kind of a bit of an aside. I mean, probably this is something that 90% people are like, okay, I don't play correspondence anyway. But yeah, that's all I need to keep in mind, that, you know, if knight 3 is the main line correspondence, well, certainly we can't go too far wrong by also playing it in normal chess. So anyway, I'll see you guys in the next training video.